The expedition. This is only the second book of so many more to come. The preparation. Deep in the Hadz sector on a remote moon of Hadzai, a meeting is being held in an underground installation where the pirate Lord Natalia is devising a new plan to venture into the space around the Oberon system, where there has been increased traffic of cargo vessels of late and easy pickings for the taking.
They are just asking for it.
One of the scurvy
and very smelly
crew said are just asking to be boarded and their bounty to be seized for their noble cause.
Well, not really noble in the slightest.
Edvar. Why are you looking at my ass? Edvar sheepishly lowering his head in embarrassment upon being caught gazing on Natalia's ass in her tight shiny black leathers with her crystal blue eyes, long flowing black thick hair and her voluptuous
chestal
region while stalking around the throne area with Edvar in behind notating their latest plan of attack upon these unsuspecting victims.
See, Edvard has a secret lustful obsession with Natalia, and as her first mate this would be a complete conflict of interest in any lawful organization, but we are talking about pirates after all, right?
She goes on to outline the plan of attack on the hollow screen in the middle of the meeting hall, all the time the pirates chomping at the bit to get in their ships and just go already. Moments later a message comes in and on the screen is a shadowy figure with its voice also coded to not relay the true being's identity.
Natalia, my dear, how have you been, my child? All is going to plan, I hope.
Natalia responded in turn and began to explain that the plan was in preparation but she needed to get some
supplies
before the plan could be executed. The hollow screen then freezes and then UN glitches again. That goddamn hollow screen, said Edvar.
I knew we haven't trusted the Banu to sell us alien tech. Look at this shit.
Natalia responds in turn.
Edvard darling.
Shut up. Edvar in the blink of an eye stopped his ramblings and succeeded to her request in an instant. The conversation then continued on the hollow screen to its final conclusion and ended with a hiss and crackle with the image shimmering and jolting into the base of the hollow screen.
Listen up, you lowlife, poor excuses for living filth. Edvard will brief you on the coming mission. Listen and don't fuck this up as we have a little journey ahead of us and we will need everything we take from our little excursion today with us on our journey,
said Natalia. Edvar then brought up the plan and took the mostly looking inbred and half-dead looking crew through the plan, confirming step by step who, what, where and when and how it will all go down. Escorts will be easy and minimal, so if they mob mentality them they'll take down their targets very quickly and efficiently.
Myself and Natalia will then disable the cargo runners and ensure that no one gets away in escape pods. If they try they will surely perish. Natalia then shouts out from in the background in her thick femme fatale Russian accent, unlike last time you didn't get them all and now we all have a heavy bounty on our head by our most annoying adversaries, the bloody subjugator assholes. Amin, I'm still very angry at you still, you stupid boy.
Armin, already an outcast of the pirate clan, was on his final warning before getting an energy shotgun up his ass and the trigger being pulled repeatedly. Armin is a young and naive recruit that fell in with the outlaw syndicate the Black Shiles, who had promised him fame and fortune, and to achieve success in life, you take opportunities and make them.
Force them.
Beneficial to your will, however that may be achieved, including shooting, stabbing or whatever means are required to achieve your goals. Sadly, this didn't work out for an anemic, undernourished farm boy whose parents had been killed in one of the Vandual raids in the Oberon sector when he was only 13 years of age. Slavers took him and prostituted him out to the highest bidders until he was too old to be viable any longer. He then roamed the stars, jumping from backwater to backwater trying to survive. Natalia found him stowed away on a merchantman that they had recently acquired only months earlier, and he had been nothing but awkward and unskilled in the pirate life, to the point where he even let a captain escape in a escape pod from a starfarer the other week. Instead of shooting the pod, he turned his back in his Mustang and ignored what was going on. This was found out far too late by Edvar, and the captain had already been intercepted by the goddamn subjugators and taken to safety, and I'm sure spilled his guts to them about what happened. Anim is just Anim, too soft to be a pirate but too useless to be anything more. Well, that's what Natalia and Edvar think of him, so they keep him around like a lost dog, a pet as such, as he's too useless to be of any help, and maybe in time will he prove his worth in other ways. A toy project, Natalia calls him.
Whatever that means, right?
A short time later, Natalia booming over the comms in the base.
Alright, you scum bucket pieces of filth from my last meal, get you scurvy rotten hulks into those pathetic rust bucket piece of shit things you call your ships and go get me some booty.
Edvar then pipes up and yells at them in turn, asses on flight deck, ladies, this isn't your birthday and you don't get a fucking cake, so get the fuck into your cockpits and fuck off already. Edvar turns to Natalia and says,
"See you soon, my queen."
And then briskly heads off to his shining new Cutlass Black that he acquired only days earlier in a card game where he beat the other player. Yes, actually beat the other player to death, as he had won but still wanted the enjoyment of driving the message home that he'd won all the same. The bay hangar doors opened to the blissful darkness of the space that greeted them. Natalia remarked, although to only herself,
"What a beautiful day to be me."
Chuckles to herself and walks off into the darkness of her den as ship after ship clumsily lift off with a sway here and a lean there, with the last to leave the hangar bay being Edvar in his spotless Cutlass, not wanting to have an unfortunate scrape on his paint due to one of the idiots under his command's less than admirable flight skills when leaving the hangar bay. As his ship leaves the doors, they slowly close and the cloaking shield then re-engages on the surface to once again hide the doors from sight. Soon after, the hollow screen in the meeting hall with the same shadowy figure on the screen.
"Natalia, my child, are you there?"
Gently whispered the figure on the hollow screen.
I was trying to get some beauty sleep, darling. What seems to be the problem now?"
The shadowy figure then begins to explain that a little pet project has gotten out of hand and that there is a need for her very specific skill set to
sort this out.
The conversation continues for a moment and then a warning with a red triangle and mark fills the screen and interrupts the conversation mid-sentence. "Security breach in Sector 5", and the message repeats, "Security breach in Sector 5 and 6. Immediate attention needed." Natalia then abruptly interrupts the figure on the screen and says briefly, "I'll come see you and we can talk about this in more depth once we're face to." Alert, alert. Imminent breach of main doors. Natalia then ends the conversation with,
"Darling, I've got a little problem. I'll come and see you soon. Have to go, bye."
Natalia then swipes with her right hand to the right and closes off the call. The hollow screen is awash with information with alerts left, right and center. With a wave of her hand and an audio command in Russian, up comes the full screen of the surrounding space outside of the base. A UEE dreadnought and 2 Idrises along with a 3-squad complement of fighters was passing dangerously close to the moon base and scanning has commenced. Natalia then sends another command in Russian to the hollow screen to power down the entire base into pitch black deadness with only the light emitting from her arm's hollow screen to provide a very dim light. The radio chatter over the comms of the UEE ships could be heard over her arm-mounted hollow screen upgrade, voices chattering and commands being sent forward and back. A moment of sheer terror arose as she heard,
"There seems to be an energy source from the moon," said someone over the comms. "It must be just your scanners bouncing a false signal off the surface onto the dreadnought. Is it very weak or strong?"
Natalia's quick thinking had her realize that at this moment, with the position from where the alerts were coming from and the position of the enemy fleet, that by this time they had maneuvered past the main hangar doors and the energy signal they were reading was for the cloaking device on the doors that had its own solar energy backup relay, and that she would have to access her hollow arm set and disable the backup, revealing the hangar doors but removing the energy signature from there. Scanners. She in a flowery pressed a series of buttons on her arm and then muttered in Russian the disable command. Moments later.
The energy signal is gone, sir, but I'm sure I saw a glint of metal shining on the surface out of the corner of my eye as soon as the energy signature stopped, sir. The dreadnought captain then responds. All crew, this is your captain speaking. We have much more important matters to attend to. Let's not get caught up with the stars and the tricks they can play on our minds. We've been out here for far too long as it is. We have a mission and that is what is important. We can report the anomaly to Terra HQ for now. We have much more pressing matters to attend to. Form back up and fall into escort formation. We have a mission to complete. All scanning then ceased and the fleet continued into the darkness. Natalia sat there and began to contemplate while sitting on her throne in the darkness of who she had become. She thought to herself, if not for more than a brief moment. This life, hiding in the dark, always in the dark, why? Why do I live this life? Then as she had begun to contemplate her existence, a message appears on her arm set. Message reads: Natalia, we have reached the engagement zone. Yours forever faithfully, Edvard. Although Natalia despised any form of cordiality, she had a small warm spot in her heart for him and always got a split-second smirk when he would send something so sweet. But was always sure to never let the crew ever see this show of affection, as she had a cold and bloodthirsty reputation to uphold, and the slightest show of emotion could completely destroy her control and position over these low-level backstabbing scum bastards in a blink of an eye. A pirate never shows weakness in front of his/her crew, it's unheard of. And a very dangerous behavior, ensuring you won't be lord for long. But in that moment in the dark, a small piece of what remained of her humanity rose to the surface. She looked at the message again and sent it to archive along with all of the other messages Edvard had sent in past. She wiped a single tear from her left eye as it slipped down her milky white cheek and then came to her senses again. She closed the hollow screen on her arm and began the boot-up sequence after already restarting the cloaking device to bring the base back to full operational capacity. Meanwhile, Edvard and the scurvy scum he was in charge of were at the edge of the Oberon sector. They had sent out a herald to perform some deep space scans to find the point of entry and exit for the traffic that had been heading through the sector, and to set a plan of attack and or interdiction dependent on the soon-to-be victims in their wake. Hours passed and nothing back from the herald, and the crew were becoming mutinous in their thoughts. Edvard performed a comms check. Some were awake and others snoring to high heavens in their cockpits. With a boom and chirp over the comms like a bullhorn. Oops, sorry about that, scumbags. Pressed the wrong button. All of the pirates then began to report in one after the other. Oi fuckstain, really? Said one of them. Yeah boss, you're an asshole. I'm now more deaf than I was before. Edvard then began to speak eloquently and facetiously to the crew with a giggle in his speech. Alright, you grubby sons of backwater city whores, this is the plan. One interrupted and said, hey, you rooted her last week, boss, and she said you're not that limp dick fag that we all think you are. The entire crew burst out in laughter. One even pissed his seat in his aurora from laughing too hard and from also secretly drinking a whole flask of 200-year-old bourbon, which is probably more the case for why, but we digress. Edvard simply responded with, Touché, good sir, though I will say your mother has been the nest I've had in a while. Oh, that's right, she's the backwater city slut of the year 10 YRS in a row. She showed me the plaque above her rat-infested bed. Then a further roar of laughter came across the comms to a point where some of them had passed out from oxygen deprivation for a moment or two. The laughter soon subsided, and then across the comms, Edvard roared, Shut up, look. The entire flight crew stopped in almost an instant. There was a massive convoy of starfarers laden with quantum and space fuel coming up on the screen. Edvard then called out to the herald again. Comms check, Ammon, where the fuck are you? You better not be playing with that little thing again, you dirty little whore son. Still no response. Moments pass and still no response. Edvard thought to himself, we can't chase after that little throwback no matter how fond Natalia was of him as her little lost puppy. He was nothing but a liability, and this was a perfect example of that. It's like he's just disappeared into thin air, said one of the crew in an actual rare case of sincerity. Edvard had his suspicions but kept them to himself as no comment was relayed back to the crew. Edvard then began to bark orders. "Okay, you lot flank left, you lot flank right, you son of Satan's ass hair, get up on my right, we're going to go under and come in from ahead and cut off their escape." All of the flight crew pulled it together and begun the setup. Once in place, they all clicked their comms button twice to annotate their readiness to engage. The left wing came in and began to engage the Wardens, while the right wing came in and began to engage the Hornets. Edvard and his wingman began the interdiction run, as one little perk of his Cutlass Black was that it had a interdiction module only fitted to it for testing the day he obtained it from his unlucky rival. This was the perfect opportunity for him to test out this experimental tech, as this was tech only usually reserved for much larger ships. Edvard then rang out over comms. "Keep them busy for now. I'm sending in the Warlock to disable to the lead ship, and I'm trying some new tech I've got on this beauty. Keep your channels open no matter what. Understood, you sons of dirty bitches." The crew, while dodging weapons fire and rockets, all rang out in turn. Yeah, you motherfucker, you always get the easy jobs, fuck you." Edvard then chuckled and replied with, "It's nice being the boss, now get back to work, you limp dick sons of bitches." Edvard then gave the command to the Warlock pilot, and the attack run on the cargo ships began. Ship after ship in the convoy pulsed one after the other, all lay dormant in the darkness that surrounded them. You could see through the cockpit windows the sheer terror of what they knew lay ahead as Edvard let off his devastating interdiction weapon. The area of effect was much larger than he had expected. It had actually taken out one of the Wardens that was close to his ship while engaged with an Aurora, and both had begun to pirouette in a circular dance with no engines or cockpit lighting apparent in either ship. All he could do is watch them spiral off into the darkness in this ballet of circular motion. At first, for just a moment, he felt shocked that he had taken out one of his own, then looked at the situation as reasonable losses for such a rich haul. Then went back to the mission at hand. He then sent the Warlock in to engage the last remaining Warden, as the Hornets had just been dispatched to EMP it into submission with a rocket flurry for good measure to ensure its demise. Once the final blinding explosion happened, he powered down his weapons, keeping the interdiction module working at full capacity to ensure no runaways in life pods could escape, as they need meat for the slavers this week.
Yet another contract. They had a regular basis, bread and butter work for their syndicate.
Several hours passed and the onboard resistance had finally been quelled and dealt with on each ship. The Caterpillar was the last and offered the most resistance, but was also overcome as well. Although these were the scum of the universe, they were specialist marksmen and were not to be taken lightly as hardened professionals. Only one force in the universe matched and, in some respects, exceeded their skill. These are the subjugators that hang around Tavaria. Many parleys had been addressed in the years gone by, but it always ended in a firefight, and heavy losses were always a regular occurrence on our side. Although it seemed that not one of them fell in a fight, it's like they were ghosts or something, so negotiations fell by the wayside, and now they hunt us like dogs, every chance they get. The UEE poses a threat, but not to the same level as they do. Once the last of the resistance was quelled, the crew were all taken by the slavers who had been contacted by Natalia in the meantime from HQ, and like clockwork they came for their booty of bodies. Any of them with even a scratch would end up with a non-payment, so you could call Edvard and the crew gentlemen pirates, as they would never damage the merchandise prior to handover on missions, as these were walking, breathing UECs, especially young attractive females. They could fetch a very pretty penny for each one detained for handover. The Starfarer call sign Axion had such a rare beauty as her captain, fiery red hair, soft tan skin and an athletic firm body to match. Small freckles adorned her face under her eyes and the bridge of her nose. Freckles to slavers fetched an additional bonus, as they could put these kinds of females into extremely high-paying prostitution. There is a very highly sought-after niche club of clients who will pay a premium for the benefit of a pure human for the night. This included the Xian, Banu, and human client base. She unfortunately was as resistant as her fiery red hair would have had you assume. This one had to be dealt with by Edvard himself. With her restrained by both arms as not to cause damage by two of the crew, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a powdery substance. It was tail Ryan cat's eye. This would put the victim into a state of hallucination and then fall blissfully asleep. Needless to say, this was outlawed in every sector or the known universe aside from Mula in the Banu sector on the black market.
More about why that is later.
As she stopped struggling and began to fall into her stupor, Edward watched and had an epiphany. If he could have at the last parley meeting with the subjugators put this through the ventilation system and had got the crew to put on respirators as it came through. Hindsight, he then thought to himself. As the crew finally had her fall to sleep, they carefully placed her on the floor of the bridge and waited for the slavers to arrive. 2 hours had passed and still no Ammon in the Herald. No answer, nothing. Edward asked one of the crew to go to his last known location, all the while thinking to himself that Natalia was going to have his hide for this once they got back. Jared, who flew a dilapidated cutlass, went for the run. Soon after, over the comms. "The little bastard is nowhere to be seen, boss. I can't even pick up ship debris on my long-range scanners, so he didn't get blown up as far as I can tell from here."
Although they only worked half the time.
Edward then told Jared to then come back and help with loading of the cargo so they can get the hell out of there before anyone found out what they were doing. Several hours later, the pirates had finally finished the loading of all the cargo onto the newly obtained Caterpillar, and some of the crew had set their ships to auto-land back at base and took the helm of the Starfarers and other cargo ships, though the slavers were running late today and this wasn't a usual kind of thing for them. Just as Edward was about to contact Natalia, a blip on the bridge of the Caterpillar showed incoming ships. They were the Banu merchantmen with the slavers on board. Soon they saddled up and began their transaction. All went well, until they saw the freckled redhead woman. The Banu stood there in shock and awe to what they were seeing. One piped up and said, "We didn't bring enough UECs for that one. Why didn't you tell us you had such a fine prize? You only usually give us low-level meat." Edward went on to explain that this was as much of a surprise to us as it was to them, and this is how things sometimes worked out. The Banu then relied with, "Fine, we'll take the lot and tell Natalia the rest will be transferred later on in the cycle."
Day.
Edward asked for them to contact Natalia in front of him to arrange that on his arm set to ensure the message was clear and witnessed in real time. The Banu aren't always the most reliable and professional of species, and this would allow for an interspecies contractual agreement to be made with a digital form and verbal recorded agreement that the Banu will transfer all outstanding agreed funds by the end of today's cycle without fail. If there was a failure to provide payment, that they would be hunted down and dispatched by the pirates without a second thought, and all assets to the value of the transaction would be seized, including their homes, the merchantmen themselves, although they wouldn't be alive to care anyway by that time. Though their families would still. Once the meeting on board the merchantman and Natalia's agreement was made, all parties went their separate ways. The redhead woman was placed on their finest bed on board their ship and put into stasis for the journey back to Eula. The rest were caged and the Hessian cover draped over to segregate them from view. Edward and his crew then headed for the disassembly junkyard on Hades I to reclaim and sell the resources for a high profit. The Starfarers, though, were taken to a secret meeting location outside Oberon II, where the rest of the crew had begun to rendezvous at already. Once all had been done on Hades I, Edward thought to himself that he was in need of a good hot shower at HQ, but was dreading Natalia's welcome without Ammon in tow. Being the hard-headed pirate he was, thought to himself, what's the worst that could happen? She'd shoot me. Nah, she won't shoot me, but I am quite scared of her all the same. Maybe she'll stab me a heap of times. Yeah, that's more like what she would do. At least I can survive that, hopefully, if I get medical attention quick enough. His thoughts continued to play out each and every scenario as he traveled back to base. Once he had come into land, this scenario played out. "Edward, how are you, my darling?" asked Natalia. She went on to compliment him for getting such a wealthy prize for us, and that she already knew that Ammon had disappeared and that she already had bounty hunters looking for him, and the fact that he's obtained such a prize for her, that is also why she hasn't killed him yet, and that he was a little more important than just a pet, but just barely. Luckily for Edward, that is. Edward, then trembling in his boots, then headed off for his shower. Natalia quietly stalked her way down the hallway to his officer's quarters and snuck inside and quietly sat there and watched him shower. It seems that although she wanted him, she couldn't have him, so she would watch when she could and dream about what could be but never be while she was the lord of the pirates. The journey. Outside the Oberon system, the last of the Starfarers was making its final maneuvers to get into position for quantum to the secret meeting location, when a blip, then nothing, and then another static shimmer comes across the radar on the ship's bridge. The hollow screen then comes to life. "We are the subjugators of Taveria. What is your purpose in this part of space unescorted?" It was a ghost squad patrol doing their daily sector protection run. The pirate at the helm of the Starfarer quickly made up a story, where they had been separated from their convoy in the Hades system by pirates and that they were told to enter quantum and meet at these exact coordinates. "They have just jumped here and there isn't anyone here, the rest of them must have all perished in the fight, we only made it out by the skin of our teeth, now we're here and no one made it, we'll head back to Terra and report back to our company the losses." A few moments of silence, then with a chirp of the comms, the administrator piped up. "Do you need an escort back to UE space?" He further then went on to explain the benefits and costs involved if they accepted the escort. As he was the only person on board, he had no choice but to accept the terms and be escorted the thousands of miles back into UE protected space. The subjugators formed up all around in a protection formation and began to the quantum pathway calculation to begin escort. Over the comms, trajectory calculated. Starfarer Axion, please comply with the quantum path and enter into your navigation systems for jump. Once you have done so and you are set for quantum, please synchronize your countdown with us so we can jump together. No response from the helm. The administrator then repeated the last command. "Starfarer Axion, do you read me? Do you comply?" Still nothing over the comms. "Ghost," called out the administrator. "Go and see what's going on." Ghost broke formation from on top of the Starfarer and nosed his Ghost Hornet to the helm to look in the window of the ship. "ACH, there's no one there? For fuck's sake, I think we've been had." The administrator then ordered all ships to raise shields to full and lock missiles on the Starfarer and all in with Ghost at the front of the ship, immediately. The administrator then radioed back to HQ and told Supernova what was going on and to run the ship codes on our systems back at base. She complied and said, "Well, darling, it seems that our little friends there aren't telling you the truth. This ship was reported as lost in a pirate raid earlier on in today's cycle, and this could possibly be a pirate trap." The administrator then thanked Supernova for the information and said that he owed her a drink at the bar once he got back to base. She happily giggled and thanked him for his offer, but could, you know who, buy it for her instead? On the rare occasion the administrator showed anything but stoic behavior, he laughed.
"Well, try to."
And told her that he'll give, you know who the UECs once he's back. She gladly replied with a warm thank you and to not die out there, as he had to pay for that drink still. The administrator then finalized the call and moved into position to enter the rear boarding hatch of the Starfarer. The rest of the squad were nervously chuckling as they had heard the entire conversation on comms, as he'd set to broadcast and not a private channel. The fact they had heard his extremely poor excuse for a laugh was hilarious, but under such a stressful situation, focus on the job at hand also took a much higher priority at the same time. As the administrator opened the rear bay door, energy weapon fire from what looked like a sidearm zapped past his right ear, almost grazing the side of his helmet. The administrator then knew in that moment exactly what he had to do. Over comms. "Shots fired, hold position until I can identify how many of them there are." Moments later, and a crack shot straight to the head of the pirate on board from his ballistic rifle. "Enemy one down." The crew continued to wait in silence. Moments later over the comms. "I'm not going to hurt you, it's okay, we're here to help," said the administrator. Flash fire then rang out over the comms. "What the hell is going on in there?" The administrator went on to explain that a small child had locked themselves in the cargo bay in a large storage container, and further went on to explain the entirety of what had happened earlier in the day. All she kept saying was that they took her mum. Where is her mum? The administrator then thought the worst, maybe she was a casualty at first, but then young girl.
About 12 YRS of age.
Went on to explain that no one was killed, slavers took everyone and they took my mum. I could hear her fighting back but they gave her something and then she passed out while two of the pirates were holding her arms. It happened here in the cargo bay and I had the lid open just enough to see it all happen. She said. Her mother had told her if this was ever to happen to do exactly what she did. The administrator then told the girl to get back in the cargo container and close the lid until he had cleared the rest of the ship by himself. He would come straight back for her once it was safe. The young girl complied and went back to hiding in the cargo box. The administrator then reported back to the squad that one enemy was down and he was going to clear the rest of the ship and for Flashfire to attend to the girl and get her into an escape pod in case things went downhill from here in. Flashfire complied and boarded the ship and proceeded to take the girl to the closest escape pod, sit her in and set the coordinates to eject to the closest safe planet in the Oberon sector for retrieval. He reassured her we would follow her in if the worst happened and that she is safe with us, no matter what. The young girl apprehensively agreed as Flashfire closed the hatch and locked it tight. The big red button he creamed out through the portal window to the escape pod. She nodded with an almost facetious smirk in acknowledgement, then sat back and nervously waited for what was to come next. Flashfire then exited the Starfarer and got back into his ship and reformed up in the nose of the Starfarer again. Moments went by, no response from the administrator. The Wrangler rang out. Oi asshole, what are we waiting for, Christmas or some shit? Hurry up and fuck those shitholes up so we can go home, or do you want me to come in and do your job for you for fuck's sake? The administrator finally reached the bridge, told Wrangler to fuck off you Xian parasitic anal snake. And that the ship has now been cleared. As the administrator turned to walk away from the bridge he saw a flashing red light on the helm. A silent alarm had been set, the ship was in countdown to scuttle. Without a second though ran, yelled out over comms. The ship is about to scuttle, get the hell out of the area, that's an order. Go. The administrator then heard the countdown being on board. The count started at 20 seconds. He had calculated it was just enough time to exit the ship, get in his barely reach a safe distance before this thing lit up space like a nuclear bomb as it was laden with extremely highly combustible hydrogen quantum fuel in its tanks. As he ran past the escape pod he punched the glass in the portal as to say press the button. The young girl had already heard the alarm and had already pressed the button. The pod was now preparing for ejection. As the administrator exited the rear cargo bay and had evaded to his ship, the escape pod ejected safely within. By the time he was back in his cockpit and had fully powered back up, had the thrusters of the pod finally engaged. The rest of the squad had already boosted to the safety of Oberon 2 where the pod's trajectory was programmed to, with Flashfire already heading down into the stratosphere to where the pod was to land to be there before she was. The administrator then engaged boost to the moments later have the Starfarer explode and then explode again as the fuel pods had also just ruptured. The explosion was gaining closer and closer to the back of his Ghost Hornet. The pod had momentarily been engulfed by the flames to then re-emerge covered in soot but in good condition still.
Keep in mind these pods are designed for re-entry into the atmosphere.
As the administrator and the escape pod's ships cleared the detonation zone, he formed up on the pod's left and looked in the portal to see the little girl crying and distraught. SE patched into her comms and reassured her what was to happen next. Both the girl's pod and the administrator's Ghost Hornet entered into the stratosphere and he followed her all the way to the ground where Flashfire was already waiting for them. Once the dust settled and the pod was opened, the young girl leapt out and hugged them both in hysterics of tears and fear. Thank you, thank you, thank you, is all she was saying through the tears and uncontrollable shaking. The subjugators, not used to this kind of affection, tried awkwardly to succeed and comfort the girl best they could. All Flashfire was thinking was, only if Supernova was here, this would have gone so much better right now. Meanwhile, back at the secret meeting location for the pirates, Natalia has finally arrived in her constellation bristling with mantises and additional armor and turrets with panthers on all. A true harbinger of death machine in the stars and something you never want to see, civilian or not. Okay you scum, you filthy dogs, you retrenched urchas, here is what is happening now. Natalia went on to explain that they were going on a little excursion for a friend of hers and that this is going to be fun. Payment is being organized by this friend also, so we all get paid and know this is not a holiday. The crew then agreed and asked for instructions. Natalia uploaded the schematics of what they were looking and possible locations throughout the universe they might be. This was all the information that was given, and it's now our mission to ensure the client is well looked after, Natalia then went on to say. I owe this client a very big favor, so there's no failing this one, are we understood? The crew then agreed, although begrudgingly as pirates do. Our first location to search is Hades Eye, then we go from there on the itinerary we've been provided at each location. Update with the client. Edvard piped up. So we're at the beck and mercy of the client and where he/she wants us to go at any time? Am I hearing this correctly, or do I still have soap in my ears from my shower before? Natalia turned to Edvard in a sultry manner and said. Darling, I promise you don't have any soap anywhere, I promise, and with a wink turned back to the crew. Edvard's face went bright red with embarrassment and shame as he had just figured out what she had just said. The rest of the crew were a bit thick when it came to social skills and didn't pay any heed to what had been said between them. Natalia then went on to talk about the resources we have, what can be sold and what needs to be brought with us. She read of the itemized report that Edvard had provided and then stopped 3/4 of the way down the page. Edvard darling, where is the other starfarer? There are meant to be 3, 1 carrying normal fuel and 2 carrying quantum fuel, where is the other one darling? In a moment of sheer terror Edvard had this massive oversight brought to his attention, quick thinkingly said in response. It's a typo is all, there are only 2 starfarers and the Caterpillar along with the support ships, isn't that right crew?
With insinuation in his voice.
This the crew did pick up on, as if they corrected him she's be likely to kill them all in a fit of sheer malicious and terrifying anger, as previous events had led to almost all of the crew being shot the last time a massive oversight like this happened.
Just check out the meeting hall walls, energy weapon burns all over the place.
The crew agreed it must have been a typo or oversight, as so much was going on, the redhead woman and the slavers rendezvous later than expected and so on. Natalia accepted the excuse as they only needed 1 starfarer full of quantum hydrogen fuel anyway. It was the regular fuel ships she was overly concerned about. Edvard thought to himself, where the hell did that bloody idiot end up? Did he mutiny? Not possible, the ship codes, so what happened to him? Edvard put that to the back of his mind, as there were much more pressing things to get done now, and that's the selling and salvage for the journey ahead of us at the junkyard. 3 days later. The final haul of UECs along with the meat money had returned a very healthy return for the journey, and then a good amount left to be spent on luxuries and upgrades for each of the crew on their ships before we headed off. Better to be over-prepared than under-right, is what Edvard was thinking to himself as he walked out of the cashier's office at the junkyard. As Edvard got back to base and exited his ship, Natalia was in the hangar waiting his return. Edvard darling, well done. Come with me, we have much to plan for. Edvard followed Natalia to the meeting hall and began the brief with everyone else. Natalia then welcomed everyone to the meeting and then launched the holoscreen and began the brief. In the brief, schematics, planetary systems, and possible locations were spoken about and discussed. For the majority of the crew this was unlike anything they had ever endeavored upon before, and were quite awestruck by the immensity of what had been planned and what they were about to undertake. Several hours went by as Natalia explained in great depth every step of the journey and began to allocate responsibilities to each and every member of the crew as to what they were directly responsible for. By the end of the meeting it had become late in the daily cycle and the crew were mentally exhausted from what they had taken in. Usually they would end up in the bar or the galley for a hard-earned meal or drink, but this had been a very long and mentally draining day, and all the crew wanted to do is go to sleep. They all headed for the barracks along with Edvard to his officers' quarters for the night. Natalia left sitting on her throne contemplating the coming adventure in the stars. The next morning Edvard emerged from his quarters, went to the galley and had some breakfast, and then off to the meeting hall to make final preparations with the crew to begin the journey. As he entered into the grand meeting hall, a suspicious message was blinking on the holo screen. No one was around, so he thought he'd watch it. The message reads, Natalia, my child, you have been such a good girl until now. I want to meet with you at my new bar in Backwater City in the Orion sector for a beverage and an offer you can't refuse. After all I have done for you, this one request should not be beyond your grasp as a simple human, as I have taught you so well so far. Your final test awaits you upon our meeting. The coordinates are... Just as Edvard was about to read the coordinates, Natalia came booming into the meeting hall. Edvard. Why are you reading my personal messages? With a scowl and descending tone in her voice. Edvard stood there sheepishly and said, I was hoping to get a good start before we headed out on our journey, so I was checking back through the brief from yesterday and I just happened to stumble on this when I turned the screen on. Natalia went on yell at him when a notification appeared on her RSET. It reads, Who is reading our messages, my child? Can they be trusted? Natalia then averted her gaze to the message on her arm and responded quickly by saying that she has the situation under control and she will deal with it. No response was then returned. Natalia then called over the base's comms. All crew report to the meeting hall immediately. The crew came in one after the other, some with only half their clothes on, to the meeting hall. Natalia then went on to explain that in 1HR all of you need to be ready to leave. Grab whatever keepsakes you want, as you may not be back here for a very long time, if at all. The crew, disgruntled, all disappeared back into the bowels of the base to prepare for the journey ahead. 1 hour later, final systems checks were being done by the crew. All of their ships were now in pristine condition and some even had new and or converted alien tech attached to them, ready for whatever comes their way. The crew were pumped and apprehensively excited about the journey that was now ahead of them. None of them had ever dreamed about such a massive paid expedition before, just short-range hit and runs for a few UEC here and there just to get by. They were being paid by the cycle for this. It was almost like they were living in a dream, they thought to themselves, all but Edvard. He was now very apprehensive of how much of a favor Natalia owed this client as called her my child. This put grave fear into Edvard and what they were about to enter into and undertake with a crew who are not used to this kind of activity, and that they were unproven and unskilled for such a long deployment out there in the stars. What had Natalia got us onto, and would we even survive this at all? Edvard quietly got into his ship and reservedly kept to himself and began his pre-flight checks in readiness to leave the moon base for potentially the last time ever in his life.
If he only knew how correct he was in his statements, might he have done things differently if given the choice again.
Moments later, Natalia from the bridge of her constellation calls across the flight group. Today is a momentous day for us all. We get to be part of something so much bigger than your tiny damaged brains could ever comprehend. We have been chosen for a higher purpose, one that you cannot understand, but one that will change the universe forever. Beings like us will rule every inch of space, and we will be the new rulers of all that there is. You are on the right side of what is to come next, I promise you all. This is our time, and you all have power and riches beyond your wildest dreams, and a place in the new universe empire is assured. We are about to embark on what will answer everything. I won't be try to explain this to your trivial little damaged human brains at this stage. I shall let you see this with your own eyes when the time comes. The locations we are looking for are hard to find, but once we find what we're looking for, power beyond your imagination will ours for the taking, and our true combined destinies will become a reality. This is a promise, from you, Lord and Savior in the stars.
All the while one of the smart-ass is playing motivational music to what Natalia is saying, with it becoming more intense and uplifting to the point of where her speech ends. The music also ends ironically, almost like it was choreographed to suit the moment. Wink.
With that, a roar from the crew and cheering in blind adherence to her words. Engines on the deck then burst into life. The thick acrid scent of overwhelming burning aviation fuel fills the hangar bay as ship after ship take off in perfect unison.
As now their ships have all the upgrades and are in an as new condition.
The ships group by group life off and for up into squads of 8, with Natalia and Edvard's ships glistening shiny black with the sun refracting of their hulls. The crew then make a final calculation for quantum. Squad by squad enter into quantum one after the other, with a bright flash of white and blue disappear into the blackness that surrounds them. Natalia and Edvard were the only two now left. Natalia tells Edvard that he and she will soon rule the universe together and be eternally immortal. and that she also has something to tell him at another time. They both spool up their quantum drives and then also enter into quantum, leaving us with the moon base, Hades' eye and the ever-burning sun against the ever-consuming dark backdrop they highlight. Day number 1. Finally, Hades' eye came into sight. The crew staggered across the squad's line up for final entry to the planet's surface, with coordinates locked in on the dark side of the planet. The scout squad enter first and begin to pick up intermittent energy readings from the surface. Natalia Jarrett, squad leader of the scout crew, called over the comms. "We are picking something weird up on our scanners, but it's intermittent. What course of action did you want to take?" Natalia then went on to give orders across the crew. All squads were to hang back while the scout squad head down to the surface. Better they only lost a few than the entire crew. Jarrett thinking to himself, "Fuck you, Natalia, you bitch," but would have never verbalized that to her, let alone anyone, for obvious reason. Edward then took point at the rear with his squad to defend their rear flank. The scout squad headed in at a slower than usual speed as they were trying to get a definite fix on the power signature but couldn't get a solid lock. The closer they get to the coordinates, the more sporadic the signal. Once they had reached the sandy and dusty surface, Jarrett did a quick reconnaissance scouting flight to ensure the area was secure and that the rest of the crew could come down without concern and land. Scouting run done, Jarrett over the comms. "She's all good down here, boss, you're safe to land." The remaining space-bound crew then entered into the stratosphere and made final preparations for landing. As Natalia landed, the remainder of the crew became enveloped in a cloud of dust and sand. As the dust and sand had begun to settle, Natalia emerged like a panther from the hatch to then see the crew completely covered in dust and sand. At first, she mistook them for raiders and went to draw her sidearm to then hear from Edward. "Grand entrance there, my dear. Pity I've got sand all up in my junk now." "Oh, Edward, shut up, you little girl. It builds character. Now man up and be a big boy for me and begin looking for what we are here to find, okay?" Disgruntled Edward ordered the entire crew to begin scanning of the area for anything that isn't natural and start digging. The crew began their search using the inbuilt scanners in their arm sets. Multiple false readings continued to show up on their scanners, with one of them saying, "Over here," and another, "No, over here." This went on for an hour until Natalia said to Edward, "Get in your ship and try to triangulate from 200 meters up all of these readings and give me a central point of reference. It will have to be there." Edward then concurred that this was a very good idea, entered his ship and took off once again, blowing dust and sand everywhere. Natalia, though, had already boarded her ship to avoid having her hair messed up. Moments later, the Cutlass's systems, once uploading all of the readings into the computer, showed a very complex array in where the signals were not in a standardized circular pattern but more in the way of a complex crisscross of lines that only a ship's computer could calculate, but barely to show a single point of origin pointing northwest, and, in the calculation, the new coordinates 5 miles away from this position and 300 meters down. Edward then sent the new coordinates to Natalia's ship. Natalia, perplexed looking at the new coordinates, simply took off, leaving everyone in another dust and sand storm headed to the new location. Edward then opened the canopy of his Cutlass and shouted out over the roar of his engines, "Get in your ships, you sons of slaver whores, we have a new location to look at. All coordinates have been uploaded to your ship's computers already, now hurry the fuck up. You're getting paid for this." The crew, covered in sand and dust, all ran to their ships, leaving plumes of dust and sand in their wake as they ran for their ships. Moments later, over the comms, as the last of the crew took off from the surface, "It's here, darlings, we've found what we've come for. Now get your useless inbred useless corpses here, we have some work to do." In the meantime, Natalia had already exited her ship, and almost as soon as she stepped onto the surface did she hear a metallic clunk under her feet. She had basically landed on top of what they were looking for. As the rest of the crew had come in for landing, Natalia had already cleared the area of the metallic source to reveal a titanium door with a digital code pad on the left-hand side. "See, my darlings, this is how professionals do things. You could learn a lot if you just did what I said to the T more often in future."
With a smirk on her face and facetious remarks in her tone.
"Edward, darling, open this for me," said Natalia, Edvard had more skills than even the most handy of handy men, a true jack of all and master of many trades kind of guy. This was an easy fix for him. Edvard pulled out a Vanduul small handheld device from his top jacket pocket above his right breastplate and began to fiddle with it. No one dared ask how he got such a thing and what it actually did while he continued to walk around the circumference of the door waving it around. Moments later the device began to make noises and then a strong Vanduul voice spurted from the device.
In Vanduul.
Triangulation to positional star matrix readings showing depth of up to 50 meters deep and small space past what looks like an inner door. Recommended approach to enter in code. Processing. Processing. Code 2695341. The device then projected a hollow warning and then shut off.
The image showed unauthorized user detected, coordinates being transmitted to closest forces in local sector.
Edvard dismissed the message as just a malfunction to the crew who weren't any wiser to what had just happened, and the code was then entered into the door. A message in Vanduul rang out. This installation is the sole property of the Vanduul Imperium. No unauthorized access granted to any party that has not got official purpose or clearance to access this site. The penalty of death is now warranted to those not authorized. Running area scan for records. Scan beginning in 5,4,3,2,1 scanning completed. Unauthorized beings present, please recite clearance code. The message repeats. Please recite clearance code. Moments later. Clearance code not presented. All unauthorized beings and equipment has been scanned and is now being sent to the closest support forces in this sector. You now will be at the mercy of the Vanduul Imperium. Edvard looks to Natalia and laughed. There had been no Vanduul in this sector for a very long time, and by the time the message reached any of their forces we would have been long gone by then anyway. Natalia and Edvard then began ordering the rest of the now apprehensive crew into action. One of them piped up and said, "What was that thing saying? I don't understand Vanduul." Edvard went on to explain that it was a safety warning, to make sure that you wear the correct equipment when you go in, as there may be dangers inside, and to prepare before going in. The usual kind of thing when entering into a random entrance in the middle of fucking nowhere where on the ground there are doors and keypads and another race speaking end. Edvard stopped mid-sentence and thought to himself. Why the fuck am I even explaining this to this goddamn moron to begin with? Edvard then pulled his sidearm, pointed it to the pirate's head and offered him two choices. 1. Go down into the dark and sandy dusty hole.
Stairway into the pitch black.
2. I shoot you in the face and leave you to die here. The pirate nervously laughed and ran for the entrance, to only hesitate for a moment, look back at Edvard to then realize his folly if he were anything, turned back and headed in. 5 minutes passed and nothing from the entrance. Edvard called down into the darkness with no response. He then sent down another pirate to see what had happened. Moments later the pirate returned to the surface. You should have shot him instead, it ain't pretty down there. The pirate went on to explain that he'd been cut in half by what seemed to be an energy mine booby trap. Though it looks as though it was the only one, a present from the Vanduul obviously. Edvard then sent the pirate back in to do a geometric scan with another device he had taken out of his pocket above his left breastplate. The pirate gingerly went back down and began the scans, though now with the flashlight that he was carrying. A further few minutes went by. He then emerged with bloody boots that had begun soaking into the sand and dust at his feet at the entrance to the deep recess he had just emerged from, handed Edvard the device, and Edvard began to look at the readings. Edvard then quietly walked over to Natalia and whispered softly as to not have the rest of the crew hear what was being said. Natalia then ordered the demolition team to go in with their laser drill and open it up for them. Once the demolition team had reached the bottom of the stairs, they were greeted with a large stone-looking wall with glyphs and rune markings. They took images and sent them to Edvard's and Natalia's ship's databases with a notification being sent to their arm sets. About an hour later they emerged, boots bloodied and covered in rock dust and sand, to the surface. You really want to see this, it's amazing, said one of the demolition team. Edvard and Natalia then pushed past the men and entered into the bowels of the installation. Once they had cleared the stair and passed what remnants were left of the stone door, they were greeted with an ominous and impressive sight. The cavity had high ceilings to accommodate for what could only be explained as Vanduul hideout or something more. They couldn't tell in the relative low light to begin with. They could see strange equipment and lights through the dark recesses. Natalia called out to the surface for the pirates that remained topside to send down some flares and torches for them. The crew burst into action, some running down the stairs to then only be stopped by the cut-in-half carcass of one of their fellow pirates to then slowly step forward into the room that Edvard and Natalia were residing in. Once the room had been fully lit, Edvard approached one of the panels and began scans of the equipment. Soon after he had completed his scans, with Natalia impatiently waiting and becoming antsy, did Edvard finally give his report. Edvard goes on to explain. Okay, so it looks like we're a little late to the party. Natalia, I know you are frustrated, but I did manage to obtain some information that will help us find the next progenitor locations for the rest of our search. Natalia then asks for clarification on what Edvard meant. She already had been given locations and this was old news. Edvard went on to explain that the locations she had been given have no relevance to what we had found here. I think you were being sent on a wild goose chase, my queen, and that whoever that was didn't want us finding anything. Only thanks to your high intelligence and, dare I say it, a bit of luck also did we find this. Natalia then, with a rage upon her usually soft, calm-looking, unemotional face, looked at Edvard with a confused and hateful look, to then turn and leave the installation on her way back to the surface, got in her ship and sat on her bed. Edvard, realizing something was very wrong, chased after her moments later. Edvard, once she had finally unlocked her ship after him begging like a lost puppy for her to let him in, found her sobbing on her bed. This was a first for Edvard and he didn't know how to react, let alone anything but stand there in sheer terror of what she may do next. He leant against the adjacent wall and began a very pathetic attempt at consoling her. Once the tears had stopped, silence. The pirates outside had never seen this kind of anger from her, and were also shit scared of what might happen once she exited her ship. Natalia eventually exited the ship with Edvard in tow. By this time, she had cleaned herself up and put some fresh makeup onto the tear stains on her face and fresh mascara to darken her eyes again. Triumphantly she strode toward the crew and said, "Okay darlings, what we are doing now is what we should have been doing all along. We've been sent on a wild goose chase to only find what we should have been looking for, thanks to my brilliance and sheer intelligence that none of you subspecies could ever aspire to, and that is to lead us to ultimate victory against all of our foes in the universe. Especially those pesky subjugators." The crew stood there dumbfounded by her statements, but not daring to speak a single word in place of retribution, with a laser hole burrowed through their foreheads, silently agreed and began to listen to her plan. Soon after she had explained their new mission, the crew were seeing credits beyond their wildest dreams appear in their minds, and some in a daydream of what they will be doing in time to come with all of their wealth. Then, with a barking order, Edvard told them to close up the hatch, cover it back over with sand and dust, and to get into their ships. They were off to the next location and then the next,
until they found what they now knew what they were meant to looking for all along.
Days, weeks, and months pass. Locations all over the surrounding space were found, and nothing but dead ends for the most part, only stepping stone clues to where they should go next. From the Hades system to the Oberon, then to the Eula system where the Banu reside, to then all the way over to the Cathcart system where the Spider space station is, for some R&R, and to restock before heading off to the Nyx system, to then continue on to the subversively creeping into the Tohil and finally Virtus systems. This is where they found the largest clue yet. It was a pre-recording on a PDA left by the same shadowy figure that had presented themselves at the base all those months ago. The recording. If you have found this, whoever you are, I will now tell you the truth. I am a pure energy light being, and this was once my home. I have been planning for millennia this message and now have the words to say. This PDA has a universal translator built into it, so you should be hearing this in your native language as you were scanned when you entered into my domain. I have been a prisoner here for longer than even I can account for. I was let out by my friends, the Vanduul. My pets have served me well until now. They have allowed me to move throughout the universe and set up here and there to hide my true location and identity. If you have found this, you have been searching for a very long time. This I applaud you for, though this is not the end of your journey, this is but only the very beginning. Words I'm sure you wanted to hear, I'm sure. From here, if you haven't already followed my trail that has led you here already, will now lead you to the next and almost final clue in your journey to find the truth. Be aware, what is ahead is perilous and will most probably end with your demise. If you so wish to proceed, simply say yes and I will unlock your final path to the truth. Edvard, intently staring at Natalia from her left with angst in his eyes, tight-chested, forced out the words. Natalia, do you really want to know? Natalia looked at Edvard with a melancholy gaze, while looking deep into his eyes in a moment that seemed to stop time, said, yes. The PDA then lit to life and the doors to the hatch snapped shut with a loud groan of metal unlubricated and worn from age. You said yes. Now you will find the true meaning of the universe and the truth of who you are and why you're here. The doors, don't worry about them. This is just a security contingency to ensure you are pure of intention. Add that if you are now to be told everything, you will keep this our little secret. If you agree, again say yes. By this time Edvard had fallen to the back of the room along with Jarrett, as he'd snuck in shortly before the doors slammed shut. Edvard, although annoyed with Jarrett, was far more concerned with what Natalia had just done. Natalia once again said yes, then a full star map appeared in the room. Locations of Vanduul, Xi'an, Terran, and Tavarian along with another unnamed race around the Hades sector appeared on the map. Wormhole locations and star system after star system appearing, then blurring and then appearing one after the other until the three of them felt a little nauseous, to then stop with the final location, Odin. A voice then booms from the hollow display. Here is where you will find your final clue. If you choose to follow me to my final location, you will have to travel through what your worst nightmares have in store for you to finally reach me. If you are willing to do so, once again say yes. Natalia without hesitation said yes. With that, the hollow screen disappeared. The room lit up with what can only be described as a blinding white light. Then the groan and creaking of the hatch doors to reveal the outside once again. Edvard and Jarrett, utterly taken back by what they had experienced, exited the room and briskly walked toward the stairs to then exit to the surface. Not a word was muttered between them. Both men walked to their ships without a word and waited for the command to board and ready for flight. The rest of the crew looked at the two men, white as ghosts, walking without a sound to their ships. One of the crew then called out, "What hap?" and before he could finish his sentence, Natalia emerged from the darkness with a look on her face that could curdle milk. The crew member, sighting this, shut his mouth tight and waited for her command. Natalia slowly walked to her ship and, as she had taken her first step onto the lift, yelled out, "What the hell are all of you brain-dead enemies doing? Get in your fucking ships, you filthy scum, and make it quick. We have somewhere to be." The crew, almost tripping over each other, ran for their ships and readied up for flight. As they took off, leaving Edvard and Natalia as the last two on the surface, with Edvard staring at Natalia intently through his cockpit window. She simply didn't even look over to him at all. With his heart heavy and a growing suspicion in his soul, then took off as fast as he could to catch up with the rest of the crew exiting the stratosphere, with Natalia cautiously following behind. Something was amiss and only Edvard knew it. The search for a mother. Meanwhile, on the Elysium 4,
Jolan,
where the subjugators' home base is, the subjugators with young girl and Ammon in tow have just landed and are coming in for debrief. At the hulking doors to their base, which is bristling with ballistic and energy weapons mounted into the fascia along with orbital defenses honed in on the base at all times. The crew, after entering the underground hangar, walk up to. The doors open slowly to reveal the mammoth ancient Tavaran base that has now been retrofitted to suit the subjugators' needs. A true and awfully awe-inspiring sight to behold. People and machinery everywhere, welders sparking, people talking, and the sound. You could barely hear yourself think. It was like they were walking into a self-sustaining city all of its own. Many refugees and ones that had fallen through the cracks lived behind these mammoth doors, where they were safe and protected from everything that has or could harm them anymore. There were restaurants, shops, a creche, sporting areas, literally everything you could imagine in your wildest dreams. This was a true utopia and somewhere the subjugators called home.
The backstory.
Back in 2910, after the moon base and the truth being released to them, they went in search of any surviving Tavarians, as they also now share some of the same DNA as them, and felt that they had a duty to help the species recover and grow again on their home planet, as this is what the subjugators stand for until this very day. Through their searching they had come across a single elderly female pottering around inside the installation and called to her from outside the doors. She hastily disengaged the outer defenses and opened the doors. The subjugators stood there in absolute awe of what they had beheld, and without a word the administrator calmly looked back down toward the frail ghost grey figure that stood before them. She was the only Tavaran they had ever seen, and she looked to be at least 200 YRS old. "Come in, children, I've been expecting you, and just in time. I've got a hot meal for you all and a bed for the night. I'll have to close the doors though. Your ships should be safe for the night out there anyway. No one knows you're here, and I made sure that no one bothers us. We have a lot to talk about, my children. Come in, come, don't be scared of an old bird like me. That's what you call our species on Terra, don't you?" She then swayed away with a giggle and a cough. The subjugators then followed. The space was immense, and with a concerned voice the administrator piped up and asked the old Tavaran, "I'm sorry, how did you know we were coming, and how did you know how many people to feed and?" She then stopped him mid-sentence. "All will be explained over your meal, now come." The subjugators, all looking around at this immense installation, gobsmacked that the Tavarians had ever lost the war in their thoughts with such grandeur and security at their disposal. Though they didn't realize at the time, that this was their final staging area and unlike anything else they had ever built. This was their last hope, and sadly it failed them, but would not fail us now. Over the meal she began to explain she was a foreseer on Earth. We call them clairvoyants. She had seen our coming years back when she was a much younger female, and that her whole life had led up to this moment, and how happy she was to finally meet the saviors of the universe. The subjugators all sat back and took a moment to think. Braca had also said something along these lines, but there was a twist in what she began to say. "Though you are the saviors, you have dark path ahead of you, and you may not all succeed. The path is too shrouded for me to see clearly, but one or more of you may not be there in the end. As I said, the path is unclear at this stage. I may be wrong. Your future is your own. Your destinies, on the other hand, are intertwined, and you all share the same story whether you choose to or not. All will become clear in time, maybe not yours but those who follow you." She then left off and told them she was heading for a nap herself, as this is the most stimulation she has had in a very long time. Also, that she was happy to be lucky enough to gaze upon all of their faces one more time before she set off into the darkness. The subjugators found their beds close by, with their names on each and every bed, with a small envelope on each of their pillows in the main habitat area on the ground floor. The notes asked them each what their greatest strength and weakness is. Only they could answer this for themselves. To think about this as they slept, as this would surely shape each and every one of their futures separately and together as a single group. On the back of the letter also was written, "Welcome to your new home, children. You have finally found your place in the universe." Without a sound they all lay their heads down to sleep for the night, with full bellies and warm beds. Who wouldn't have? The next morning the beginning of what you see now began. "Hey Cricket, what's happening?" said Flashfire. Cricket Killer then approached Flashfire and struck up a conversation. Soon Cricket turned to the administrator and, as though he had ESP, said, "UEC's already in your account," with a wink, and walked on to his quarters. The team were finally home, and with these new friends as well. The welcoming committee, Supernova, and some other humans, Banu and Xian refugees, took them in and get them showered and fed and a warm bed to sleep in. "Here is a safe place," Supernova said to both Amin and the young girl. "What's your name, by the way, little one?" "Gianna is my name, and what might yours be, pretty lady?" Supernova went bright like a tomato and sheepishly said, "Supernova, but you can call me Nova for short if you like." The young girl seemed to like the abbreviation and agreed to call her Nova from here in. As they disappeared into the background, Ghost and Wrangler were at it as per usual, picking and punching each other in the arm to see who could hit the hardest. Until on the rare occasion Ghost gave Wrangler a dead arm, which was also a shock to the Ghost as well. Instead of apologizing, he broke out into hysterics of laughter on the floor, rolling around on the shiny metal surface of their installation while Wrangler was almost in tears from the pain. Ghost had stuck his middle finger knuckle out this time and really got Wrangler good. As they laughter settled and the Wrangler had peeled off to quarters, leaving the Ghost sitting there in pure delight, one of the security personnel came over and said, "Okay Ghost, off you trot. You bloody muppet. Find a hobby or some shite yet tight arse," said the Ghost as he heads off to his quarters as well, chuffed with himself all the way there. Hours pass and nighttime comes over their home. It was the Memorial Day solstice and a grand party had been organized for everyone on base. There was food and fireworks and singing and poetry, along with copious amounts of drinking and carrying on. Both Amin and Gianna were overwhelmed by the experience, as they had never seen anything of the like before. They were free to venture outside, knowing at any stage if there was trouble that they could all run back inside. Everyone's ships were secure underground and that they were truly safe for the very first times in their melancholy lives. Gianna also took a short amount of time to enjoy herself aside from her mother's recent abduction, as Nova, her new best friend in the entire universe, was by her side, ensuring that she was enjoying this one night never another in her life again afterward. This she could ensure, and Gianna was. She was too overstimulated by everything going on and all of the food and lights, people, and fireworks that were abound. A true night of pure serenity and safety, something that only on occasion her mother had offered her in past, between sitting on filthy cargo haulers in dangerous or non-UE space. She had become so accustomed to doing the cargo box drills and the escape pod drills that when this finally happened, the small amount of resentment she had for her mother had turned to slight apathy for her capture, although a large part of her still yearned to have her back. This night though simply didn't allow her to think such dark thoughts, only good and happy ones, in a safe place for the very first time with her new best friend in the universe by her side, enjoying it with her. How could she be sad at a time like this? The next morning the base woke to a relaxing, beautiful, tepid day outside, and the new arrivals were still asleep in their warm and comfortable beds. The subjugators were up doing morning exercises as per usual, and there didn't seem to be a worry in the world for anyone. Soon after breakfast commenced, and with the smells coming from the food court, and with Gianna and Amin rousing from their big night's slumber, were greeted with a breakfast for kings and queens. As they sat and enjoyed their breakfast, it became apparent that only civilians were at the breakfast table. Where were the subjugators? They were in the briefing room already planning a way of tracking down Gianna's mother and bring her home to us. The briefing went on for several hours, with everyone putting forward their ideas and how to best action the best form of extraction from wherever she was, with minimal casualties to the general public. They had all final come to agreement and set the plan into action. Once they emerged, they headed straight for Gianna and Amin and told them of their plans, and that they were to stay here as this is the safest place in the universe they can be, and that they would have her mother home with them as soon as possible. Gianna then had Supernova come over and ensure her that they would make it happen and guarantee it in the process. The subjugators then head out of the base to their ships and readied for flight. One after the other, with engine screaming, lifted off out of the hangar and headed for the stratosphere. As a civilian, this sight never got old, especially with such a beautiful green and blue background for them to watch their ships take off in front of. As the last of them left the hangar, the mammoth doors slowly began to close. The camouflage cover then covering the doors, with the main base doors closing soon after. The search had just begun. The subjugators went from system to system that they knew slavers frequented. Days, weeks and months passed without any of them heading back to base. They had to find her before they went home. One morning Flashfire said to the team that maybe Braca could be of some help, and that they should head out to Backwater City and check out the brothel there. At the same time he would go see Braca at the Dark Horse Inn to see if he could be of any help. The team agreed, as they were running out of places to look, and maybe he might have some answers for them, and it wouldn't hurt to check the local brothel anyway.
Ghosts and Wranglers input obviously.
The team then got into their ships and left the Trice system and headed for Backwater City in the Farron system on the planet of Azura.
Farron 3.
As they were en route, a never-seen-before energy signature began to resound on everyone's long-range scanners. The administrator then sent the signal back to Supernova, who then decoded it into human language. If you are hearing this, my children, come to the Tohill sector, I have a present waiting for you on Tohill 3. The message then repeated again and again. At first the administrator dismissed it as a pirate trap or lost message in the stars until Supernova piped up on the comms. "Ah, gentlemen," in her sweet young Russian voice Supernova continued to say. "This message once fully decoded says in text 4. Sot." The crew then sat a little further down in their cockpits and dreaded what the administrator was going to say next. "Okay everyone, looks like we'll have to check this out then." The crew grunted and told him to go fuck himself, he has a brothel to visit.
Guess who?
The administrator then explained that he needed everyone and their skills just in case this was truly a trap, they would be far stronger together than apart. The ghost reluctantly agreed, so did the Wrangler and all of the others. They were off to the Tohill system to find out what the carrier of this message had to offer. The administrator thought to himself, why the hell would Braca be sending us messages for especially like this? Then he thought to himself immediately after, well, he is an alien after all, and dismissed any concerns he might have had and continued to give instruction to the team to set coordinates for the new sector. A couple of hours later the crew had reached the Tohill system and the signal had become ever increasingly stronger. The crew formed up outside the planet's stratosphere and waited for trouble. Soon the Wrangler piped and made statement that nothing was coming to get us and to head down to where the signal was. The administrator then performed a long-range scan and didn't detect anything. The crew then prepared for re-entry. As the crew began final descent, a Xi'an cargo hauler appeared in the system on their radar, so Ghost and Wrangler stayed behind to keep an eye on the situation. The administrator, Flashfire and the rest of the crew heading in. As they broke through the stratosphere they were greeted with a deep blue rippling ocean with small green outcrops across its otherwise never-ending watery surface. The signal had directed them to a small green and lush outcrop in the southern hemisphere. They continued on toward the location on the radar. Flashfire thought that showing off his flying skill would be great for his video diary and began to lick the water with the tips of his saber's wings, then flip upside down and have the water softly brush over his canopy the whole time recording the event. This didn't impress the administrator, who watched from his cockpit the entire time with a discriminative scowl of disappointment, though at the same time had realized how much better of a pilot he'd become in years gone by. Flashfire then gently pulled -GS to pull his ship upward, to then apply his air brakes and flip his ship upright and the right way again, to then catch up on the administrator's right wing. With a smirk and a press of a button on his arm set, he finished the recording, the whole time the rest of the crew looking at him like the complete asshat he was being the entire time. Though we seemed safe and nothing had been reported the entire time with Ghost and Wrangler up there, and it had been weeks since any of they had blown any steam off as well, so the administrator forced his best smile and gave Flashfire a rare thumbs up through his cockpit window. Flashfire, then taken back, realized that there was something else on the administrator's mind. This wasn't the reaction he was expecting at all. They soon came to the landing pad. It was one of the largest on the planet. It had provided just enough space for the crew to all sit down on and exit their ships. The administrator, before exiting his ship, called up to Ghost and Wrangler. "Anything to report, gents?" They both responded. "Nah, you just go and enjoy your holiday while us poor pricks sit here and play with our dicks waiting for ya. If there were anything wrong, we'd have said something, you fucking tail Ryan anal gland." The administrator then thanked them for their kind words, exited his ship and headed for where the rest of the crew were. The platform had stairs down one side that lead to the island's surface. The administrator asked for a background on the inhabitants to Supernova and a full report was provided. Once they all made it to the ground, one of the crew piped up and said, "Hey boss, what's that?" There was a holographic sign saying "this way" with an arrow to the left. The crew all looked at each other, completely perplexed to know how it was being powered. They then, with a shrug of shoulders and confused looks on their faces, hands on sidearms, gingerly walked in the direction that the sign had notated. The island was bigger than they all first expected, and the walk took half an hour or so until they came across a rocky outcrop over the water, a small bridge kind of structure that didn't seem that stable. The administrator didn't see the problem and briskly navigated his way across to the other side. Then the rest of the crew followed in suit. one after the other saying, "Don't fall!" and laughing. Less than 50 paces later the administrator stopped dead in his tracks, put up his fist and gives the lay low command. Ahead of them were heavy metal doors with some kind of energy field around them. Then from around a corner 2 Vanduul soldiers emerged. They looked on and continued to watch. Moments passed and one of the Vanduul sensed something and began to look in their general position. Clearly having seen the glint of flash fire's sparkling white teeth, did the alarm get raised. Soon the entire crew were in a fire and energy weapons fight. The doors to the bunker come to life, the shield drops and the doors open, Vanduul stream out, every second or third being shot by the subjugators, though they continued to stream out. The administrator then called through to the Ghost and the Wrangler. "Shots fired, get your fat lazy asses down here this instant, we have a cleaning party required." Both of them with less than a chirp in their voice in unison said, "EDA 2 minutes." Minutes later as the Vanduul had begun to get the upper hand and had begun to advance on their hunkered down position, down came a hail of ballistics from both the Wrangler and the Ghost, Mantis Gatling guns blazing on both of their front mounts of their ships, Ghost in his Ghost Hornet and Wrangler in his Warden, which had been converted to a full stealth loadout. Vanduul were getting cut down left, right and center, allowing for the defending force to relocate and begin to flank their forces. The firefight then took a turn. On top of the bunker the Vanduul uncovered an anti-aircraft laser which also had an additional rocket attachment. The Ghost was the first to see and called the Wrangler off, although the Wrangler being the gun-ho cowboy nut he was only made a passing acknowledgement of Ghost's statements and continued to lay down fire, but now in strafing runs. The Ghost then after regrouping began to follow suit and flying by the seat of his pants, strafing run after strafing run in a cross-section to the Wrangler. Laser fire from the anti-aircraft gun was whizzing barely past their craft, rockets being fired with both pilots having to run to then come back once they had lost them. It seemed that there was no end to the violence, neither side were getting a foot up. Then from the background Xian ships began to appear in the background around the engagement, with a single sentence from their leader, through the universal translator. "We will take it from here, pull your troops back, we will finish this, humans." The administrator then responded with a short message. "Much appreciated, administrator out." The administrator then got everyone to fall back to safer ground. What was about to happen really needed us to move clear immediately. The Xian ships lined up behind each other and began a bombing run. Ship after ship dropped its payload in the surround area around the bunker, decimating the Vanduul who had nowhere to run. Several had fallen back to the bunker, but the doors had been damaged in the bombing runs, leaving the entrance open for attack. Soon after the Xian came to land on the scorched and pockmarked surface of the here the battle had ensued. They had explained that they had been monitoring this location for some time, but they wouldn't explain why though. The Wrangler and the Ghost also came in for landing at the newly cleared area, and after a brief meeting with the subjugators and with thanks been given to the Xian for their support, they simply got in their ships and took off. The subjugators all stood there bewildered as they had come in and provided support then just left. The administrator not being fazed by this, as he'd already sent a distress signal through to base earlier on, knowing that Supernova was going to get us help, and like always she did in stunning fashion. She had contacted the cargo crew that had just Quantum D into the sector to ask for any security forces in the area to come to our location in case of any problems, and that 500,000 UECs were also on offer to help sweeten the deal. Her negotiation skills clearly served her well, as the response we got was much more than we were hoping for. This was just another drink he owed her. It turns out that a Xian death squad had also received the signal and were already en route also, and the call from Supernova just further enticed their inquisitiveness further. They had called in further reinforcements, and this was the result. The administrator then ordered, after a short brief and plan of attack, that the squad now breaks into 2 flanking parties, one to take the left and the other the right of the bunker's doors. Soon they were in position. They could hear orders being barked deep from within the installation. It was time to finish this. "On my count," said the administrator, one after the other tightly hugging the walls on either side of the bunker's inner walls. The subjugators moved silently down the main entrance toward the first 90-degree turn to the right. The flash fire threw a grenade around the corner on a 3-second fuse. All that could be heard were Vanduul's screaming voices, then the explosion. Soon the dust cleared, wires sparking from conduits in the walls, and there lay 3 dead Vanduul with the flash fire shards still burning in their carcasses. 3 down, however many to go, said Flash Fire. The crew slowly and cautiously continued into the base. A Vanduul here and there along the way were taken out execution style as to conserve ballistics in case there was another wave still deep inside the bunker. Soon they had reached the inner sanctum of the bunker, which opened out into large underground rooms with runic symbols all over the walls. The administrator scanned each and every different symbol and sent them back to Supernova for translation. Once she had run them through the system, nothing had come up in that language. It's as though this was an ancient language, and only such examples of this were found on Hades in the ruins left from an ancient war a very long time before humans had entered the sector. These were the same, she had remarked while in conversations with the administrator. He then paused for a moment in contemplation and went deep into thought. Hey guys, do you remember what happened that time we were running that transport mission back from Hades back in the day? All of the ones that had been there that day turned in a moment of distress and asked suspiciously why. The administrator then began to explain what Supernova had just told him and that had sparked their memories of that day. These runes and what they heard on that flight. It all made sense now. This wasn't any Vanduul designed base, they certainly wouldn't have put these runes on the walls. This was an ancient's bunker, and that same feeling began to come over the original crew all over again. A single Vanduul voice rang out from the dark recesses of the next room. In Vanduul. You are right, Hamons, this is not of my people's doing, but of a force much greater and powerful than even the mighty Vanduul Imperium. We are just pawns in a much greater game. We the Vanduul are the universe's rightful rulers under the Light One, the true and only deserving being in this universe to guide us to total domination of all of the other pitiful species that we purvey over. You can kill me, but you will not change your fate, it's already been written in the stars. We were meant to stop you here, though alas we failed, and the only way we can achieve ascension is through glorious battle to the death. The solitary remaining Vanduul then burst out of the shadows with nothing but its bare claws and lunged at the subjugators. In a hail of bullet fire they dispatched it, with it coming to rest at the administrator's feet. Green blood and rank-smelling blood began to ooze from around the core. The subjugators then checked the other room for anything else that may be lurking in the dark room ahead. Nothing, called out one, and then, "Clear," said another. The rest of the crew walked into the darkened room to only then have it light up to show machinery and other strange devices around the walls. In the middle of the room, a familiar sight, a hollow screen war table with a notification that was quietly flashing red on the operations panel. The administrator walked up and pressed the button. The screen came to life and further lit the room, with a showy figure with its voice masked. Once you have taken care of our little problem, report to me immediately, as I have much larger plans for you, my children. This is but only one small issue I have compared to a much more pressing matter close to home that I will need you to deal with after this. The screen, the tour and the transmission came to an abrupt halt. On the screen, message feed terminated with a yellow triangle with an exclamation mark in it, like the message had been pulled but not in time. The subjugators then performed a final sweep of the base and exited the bunker and headed back to their ships. Not a word was muttered the entire time back by any of them, just many minds working overtime to understand why and who wanted us dead so badly. Even the administrator couldn't work out who, and if not the pirates, who else would want them dead to the point that they would have made so much effort. Must be Natalia, he thought to himself.
And her cronies.
That's put out a hit on us, as not even the bounty hunters would be stupid enough to take a contract on us and make anywhere near this much effort either. The return on investment, let alone doing business with the Vanduul? Not an option. So, who? He continued to run scenarios through his head all the way back to his ship in silence. And the rune symbols? Who put them there? It was all a matter for another time, he thought, as part of his well-organized reasoning. Once the last of the crew had made it back to the platform, escorted by the Wrangler and the Ghost, the crew took off and punched in coordinates and headed back into space. They were finally on their way to Backwater City. Homecoming. Meanwhile, back on Jalen, Amin has been exploring the local ruins and has found something. It was a high elite insignia from a Tavaran elite officer, along with other broken Tavaran technologies and weapon that he thought would make a nice homecoming gift for Gianna's mother once she had been brought back. Amin had many skills, and being creative with junk was one of his personal interests. After several hours at a modification station, he had completed his artwork, made from metals, weapons, wires, and the insignia as the centerpiece. He had also found some native flowers and had also woven a thatch basket with local fruits and berries that were available in the base, along with other strange and common things from the local area. It was a truly heartfelt gift that in itself showed the heart he had, even though all the diversity he had experienced in his life. A rare thing to see in such a cold universe. Amin hid it quietly in Gianna's room and waited for the response. Gianna was with Supernova, walking and talking outside the walls, with Supernova telling her all about herself and who she was and how she got here. Gianna's eyes were glazed over with excitement to hear of the battles and struggle that Supernova had to overcome to be who she is now. Gianna could only have ever dreamed of such experiences. Her stories were bland and boring in comparison. Though Supernova wanted to know everything all the same. Gianna reluctantly began to tell her story. I was born on Terra, the daughter, or a trader's family. We always had a hard time putting food on the table until a couple of years ago when her mother began taking on high-risk runs, and this is what has led us to this moment. Supernova, with tears welling up in her eyes and thoughts of the resemblance of a life this poor little girl has had until now, blurted out. Well, that's all over now. You'll never have to worry about that ever again, especially eating a solid meal every day. Gianna went very quiet and began to tear up. She explained to Supernova that she was already very aware of what was happening to her mother wherever she is, and that her mother had coached her for all of this, but the pain, she never told her about the pain she was currently feeling inside. Supernova then burst out into tears.
Yeah, an elite wet worker Black Ops killing machine also has a soul. What too hard to believe? The human soul is still something to this very day we can't explain.
And threw her arms around the young girl and joined sobbing. Amin, seeing this from afar, came over hastily and in typical guy fashion. Ahem, am I interrupting anything? Supernova and Gianna stopped sobbing long enough to glance over at Amin, and with their melancholy drawn tear-soaked faces both extend an arm and bring him into the embrace. Amin, at first uncomfortable, then overwhelmed by the moment and the power of the emotional situation, also broke down into uncontrollable sobbing with them. In the background, Cricket Killer was standing there at the mammoth doors to the base, looking on. He was struggling between his duty to protect and his love for Supernova. Seeing in her in such an embrace and caring for others the way she did, further drew him in even deeper in love with her in that moment. As he was about to take a step in their direction, an alarm went off in the base. Someone had received a deep space distress signal, and over the comms the message rang throughout the base. We have been attacked by pirates and we are venting atmosphere. We haven't got more than 2 hours left, no propulsion systems, and our captain is slowly bleeding to death. Whoever can hear this, please come to our aid. We have no one to help us. The message then turns to white noise and some mumbled words, then nothing. Cricket Killer,
Formerly the squad leader of the Red Squadron,
then jumped into action. He began ordering all flight crews to suit up and meet him in the hangar ASAP. Shortly after, crew members, Xian, Banu, and Human all assembled on the briefing deck ready for orders. I know you all are here today from having fought a lifetime of adversary and loss, this I thank you for. But today someone else who isn't as lucky as us has also been a victim of tyranny and hate. This will be your first engagement since reaching refuge with the subjugators. All we ask is you do your best, do not take any unnecessary risks, and Supernova and myself will be leading all of you from our respective squads from here in. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Cricket Killer. I was the squad leader for the mighty Red Squadron on the Craxus Bengal carrier in the secret elite Black Ops division of the Messan Empire. We were the offsiders to the Black Squadron that has already headed off to find our newest young one, Gianna's mother. Our duty is to ensure we save these people, without payment or favor, as this is what we do, as you yourself have been the recipients of our help in past in one way or another. We ask that you help us help these poor lost innocents now." Cricket Killer then passed over to Supernova for the brief to continue. "Hello everyone, my name is Supernova and have had the utmost privilege to also participate in the same life as Cricket Killer, and I am also here to ensure your safety as your squad leader in the coming hours. Together we are strong, divided we are weak. All we ask is that you stand by us like we will stand by you to the very end, as this is the law of the subjugator. If you attack a subjugator, more and more subjugators will come with even more force and malice until our enemies are vanquished. We will not stop, we will not wane, we never give up until the last of us falls. We are retribution materialized. If you come across a subjugator of Tavaria, you better hope that we don't put you on our list of things to put into the ground today. Remember our code and you will always be triumphant. We are the good that is doing what needs to be done, has to be done for safety and liberty in the Outer Rim. All we ask is that you stay safe, as your wars are well and truly over, ours never will be while the Vanduul and this scum that call themselves pirates exist. I personally want to thank each and every of you personally, but time is not our friend right now. I promise to do so though our return." Supernova then ended with a hoorah. The pilots also responded with a resounding hoorah. She then asked for the squads to mount up and wait for instructions once their pre-flight checks were completed. Soon the flight group had run all pre-checks and had ignited their engines ready for liftoff. Over the comms, Supernova began to bark instructions along with Cricket Killer to their respective squads. Ship after ship in a blazing plume of smoke and avionic gases lifted off and began their journey into the stratosphere. With Supernova and Cricket Killer following in hot pursuit, her in her stealth M50 and him in his stealth Gladius. Once the flight crews had formed up into position and the final orders given, the countdown to quantum began. 5 to 1 engage. They were heading for the Davian system above the planet Davin 2.
Sestulus.
Several hours passed and the flight crews were speculating on what they were going to come across and whether it was a trap or will there be anything left. The flight leaders quietly listened into the speculation with an uneasy feeling that was slowly beginning to creep into their guts, about what they were about to come across. They knew from the murmurings that the rest of the flight crew had no real idea of what was ahead, but didn't want to worry or scare them prior to making it to the coordinates to perform reconnaissance first. Another couple of hours passed as they finally made it to the Davin sector. Cricket Killer and Supernova ordered their flight wings to hold back and perform scanning while they went ahead to perform reconnaissance. After a short jump, they both side by side exited quantum 500 meters from the stricken vessel. Atmosphere was clearly still venting from the right rear from the 600I, where scorch marks were clearly present upon her soft clean white stern. Hydrogen fuel was also venting from a scorch mark on her left-hand side as well. 600I Captain A equals, do you read me? Called out Cricket Killer. With no response. Again. Captain of the disabled 600I, come in. Still no response. Supernova called to the rest of the flight crew and asked for them to come to our location and provide area support while both Cricket Killer and Supernova Eva to the ship to see what was going on inside. Soon after they both entered into ship, they were greeted with a gruesome sight. The captain had been pinned to a wall with what looked like laser bracelets.
Energy cuffs, that would attach to any surface and restrain the wrist, leg, or neck, without the need for a clasp like regular cuffs.
These were slaver tech. The captain's guts had been spilled all over the otherwise pristine marble floor in the main lounge area. The rest of the passengers gone without a trace. Through the report said pirates, not slavers. Said Supernova out of nowhere. Cricket Killer glanced at her with a whimsical look and then looked away again. It was clear that the pirates may have disabled them, but why hadn't they towed the ship? Why was this not reported by the local security forces, as it was so close the planet in orbit? Then a bellow from outside the hull of the 600I. This is the UEE. You are in a quarantine area, please exit the ship and come with us to the surface for decontamination. You are not under arrest, as we have seen you intercepted the same distress signal we have, and we know you are and why you are here. Please EVA back to your ships and have your entire flight crew follow us to HAB 6 quarantine dome. Both Supernova and Cricket Killer looked at each other in fright and angst. We better do what they say, she said. Cricket Killer agreed and they complied. Hours later at the quarantine dome in HAB 6, doctors in specialized suits had been scanning them to then have them, got rid of all of their clothes to then showered and washed themselves in an acrid orange solution that smelled like a cross between tar and bleach. It burnt their eyes and nostrils the whole time they were washing themselves in it. Every one of them had to go through the same process, although they had not entered the ship. Their ships were in quarantine also and were getting scrubbed from top to bottom with a laser anti-biological multiple pass over as well. What had they got themselves into? The truth. Several days later, a medical doctor walked into the infirmary, both Cricket Killer and Supernova sitting in their beds and talking with each other, speculating on what was to happen to them now. As the doctor entered and grabbed the hollow pad with their medical details on it, they ceased to speak. The doctor, intently studying the information on the screen, continued to slowly walk toward their beds. A few taps of the screen later and finally he looked up to greet them. He went on to explain that the virus they had contracted was a rare Vanduul ailment that usually doesn't ever affect humans, but it had seemed that the genetic structure of the virus had been altered in some way, clearly not something that anyone had seen before in the medical world. The 600I had been traveling near the Virgil sector. The crew were all too sick to explain why they had even strayed so far off course and how they were not intercepted by Vanduul.
Or had they been? Instead of attacking, they boarded the ship and attacked them with this virus instead. Was this a new form of warfare that the Vanduul had tried to begin? At this stage it had seemed that none of the subjugators had contracted the virus but had come in contact with it and had an antibody reaction to it. The doctors couldn't explain why both Cricket Killer and Supernova had not contracted it, as all of the crew of the 600I had already died from the virus, presenting with blisters, then coughing and then finally coughing up blood, then dying shortly after. A truly terrifying sight to have to endure as a medical specialist. The doctor asked them both,
"How are you both feeling today?"
They both responded with,
"Perfectly fine. Why?"
The doctor then ran some further full-body scans from the medical light beam technology that seemed to emit from the ceiling without any presence of equipment powering it. The scans traveled down from their heads, down to their feet, to then back to their heads and then stopped. The hollow pad in the doctor's hand lit up, and to his amazement, no trace of the virus was left in their systems. He asked that if it would be okay to take blood samples for further testing and that he would really like for them to stay on for a little longer. The medical staff wanted to see if there was something that they could use in their blood or through biopsy, anything that may be the key to their immunity. They both were about to decline the offer when the doctor on the comms had his name called. He briskly ended the conversation as something had also appeared on his hollow pad, a message maybe? His only next words were,
"You're free to go whenever you please."
The doctor then briskly exited the room with the doors hissing open and then closed shortly after. Both Supernova and Cricket Killer sat, shrugged, and got out of their beds, went to the clothes closet, and in the closet was not what they were expecting. Instead of their own old clothes and space suits, they had been provided with brand new equivalents of their old clothes and space suits. Both of them looked at each other in a moment of confusion to then grab the gear out and put it on. Supernova had a small piece of paper wafted down like a feather to the bottom of the cabinet. At first she didn't recognize it, though Cricket Killer with his sharp eyes had caught it out of the corner of his eye and mentioned it to her as they were readying up. She went back to the cabinet, leant down and grabbed the slip of paper. It read,
"As a thank you from us here in Dome 6 for all your help and patience throughout this ordeal. We think we have found a cure, and it's all thanks to you. Warm and very appreciative regards, Medical Team Dome 6.
Both of them smiled at each with a semi-grin and continued to get their new and slightly tight-fitting clothes on for the first time. They signed their paperwork and headed out into the rest of the domed city. After they had found a small food outlet and had something to eat, they had both come to the conclusion, It's time they got back to their ships and rounded up the rest of the squads. The rest of them squads had been cleared days earlier and had been hanging around the city waiting for an update. Some had been catching up on sleep and others had been busy mapping the city for future expeditions in future. There were shops galore, an entertainment dome that represented each race and its favorite pastime. Historical museums and corporate offices in other domes. There was also only one exit on the eastern side of the city to wasteland that surrounded them. This would need further investigation at a later date. Several hours later the crew had all gathered at the landing zone and had begun to saddle up ready for instructions. Supernova first spoke.
All of you, thank you for your patience and willingness to endure this ordeal. This shows the truth of what it is to be a subjugator and what we represent to the universe.
Cricket Killer then went on to explain what they had learned, and our focus was to now head back to Jalan, to regroup and gather our thoughts. They also needed to head home to protect all of the refugees as well. That was their main duty. Both squads agreed with a
Hoorah!
And began to power up their engines for liftoff. They all took off with a roaring howl. Clearly, they just wanted to leave the sector of space and head home. Both Cricket Killer and Supernova commentated to each other while watching them all get to the stratosphere as quickly as possible. Finally, both Cricket Killer and Supernova also left Dome 9's hangar and headed for space as well. In the meantime, at Backwater City, Flashfire had landed and was heading for Brocka's Bar, now formally rebranded as the Dark Horse Inn in fond memory of the Craxus. He landed in on the same pockmarked landing zone and exited his ship to the pockmarked and dusty surface. He began the long walk through the dusty and rotten streets on his way to the Dark Horse Inn. The rest of the crew were still on their way, as he wanted to do some forward scouting on the way. He said he had a
funny feeling, and it's not a good one.
In his gut. The administrator had agreed to let him scout forward, as this wasn't always a
safe
part of space, and to report back anything on the way, including when he landed. As Flashfire walked the streets, he saw the same little beast in the same street waiting for a victim. He placed his hand on his sidearm, itching to shoot it, not kill it but scare it off though. Nasty little blighter's tail Ryans, he thought to himself. As he unclipped the retaining strap to his sidearm in readiness to fire, a security peacekeeper patrol in heavy armor rounded the bend. Peacekeeper patrols are ex-paramilitary or mercenaries that don't have the cojones to live that life anymore. Though they're not the kinds of people you want to get offside, still, they shoot first and ask questions after. The shop owners and local
government
pay them to do whatever it takes to ensure the peace. Flashfire quickly reclasped his sidearm and greeted them with a wry smile and a nod. They then looked in the direction of where Flashfire was focused and said in passing, "That one has no teeth, it's harmless, that's why we let it skulk around here. It's a pest that has adapted to begging for food and UECs, not at all like a typical tail Ryan at all." The men then walked on, muttering to each other as they disappeared into the hustle and bustle of the dirty and rotting streets of Backwater City. Flashfire took poise and for a moment took pity on the small creature, and for a moment thought he'd offer some UECs to the creature to help it feed itself. As it had no natural defenses, it would not be of any harm, he logically thought to himself. He slowly walked up the dusty and derelict side street. No shops were open and no one in sight. With his hand on his sidearm clasp unlatched, once again approached the creature. It was crying like a small child. Every bone in his body was shaking with anxiety, as this is usually lead to an attack. The creature then turned to him and recoiled, seeing the heavily armored human with hand on sidearm walking its way. The creature then opened its mouth to reveal only gums. All of its razor-sharp teeth had been removed from what looks like force. Its gums were scared and swollen. Actual tears were running down its face. This was unlike any tail Ryan he had ever experienced from military or documentaries he had ever seen in past. This was a truly broken creature that wanted help. Flashfire's mind was running at 1,000,000 miles an hour. What should I do? I can't leave this thing here to continue to cling onto a bare existence like this. It's not our way, he was thinking to himself. Then the creature did something extraordinary. it began to try to speak.
Please he LLLPPP.
Me no harm, me try survive, Vanduul do this, me escape end here. Please he LLL.PPP. The creature then began to cough and wheeze. It was very malnutritioned and was dying right in front of his eyes. Flashfire's humanity then took over. He asked the creature if he could take it home with him to his home planet on Jalan to recover and assimilate with all of the other refugees and become one of his people. A place with no violence or threat, no need to beg or steal, a place where it would be safe for the rest of its days. The creature broke out into uncontrollable tears, wheezing and coughing in between the mournful spluttering. Flashfire also drew tears and went to touch the creature on the back to console it. The creature, too weak to recoil, allowed the affection, its eyes securely fixed on Flashfire the entire time. It clearly had never been shown any form of affection in its life, and this was the first time it had been ever. Flashfire then asked through his tears, when was the last time it ate. Before it answered, it then said,
My name is Tularia. I am a female of my species and my mate was killed by the Vanduul at the testing facilities on Cryan.
Caliban too, when I saw my chance and left in the garbage disposal pod on one of their ships. The pod was ejected and I was left to feed myself on whatever was left in the pod. I eventually ended up here once the pod had come crashing down on the planet you humans call Uriel. Oberon too, some humans came across my pod on the freezing surface. Luckily the heat from the rotting waste kept me alive for long enough until they found me. I was almost dead as well. They took pity on me and took me to one of their underground cities and nursed me back to health. I learned their language and was always willing to help in whatever way I could. Resources were always scarce, so I had to work for my food. I was happy and felt safe for a while at least. My humans soon died a mere 100 years later, and I was once again on my way in the cargo bay of a starfarer, hidden in a cargo container full of Xian flower apples that I consumed on my journey to where we are now. Once we had landed, the dock crew performed a scan, I think, and found me. Without a word, weapons drawn, kicked me off the ship, and here I am today. I have been living off waste and goodwill for a very long time in your years. I am back to where I was in that garbage pod. I have no hope, please help me, human. I will serve your people well and never leave, as this Jalan you say is a utopia and somewhere I would happily call home for as long as your people will allow me to stay. My species is almost eternal as we regenerate our organs and never really die, although our time eventually comes like all things in the universe. My time is still very far off as I am only on my second organ regeneration. I still have many to go. I also think this is why those disgusting animals reeking of rotten flesh and sulfur were after the key to immortality. Flashfire by this time had dried his tears and had already in his mind readied himself for what he was about to say. Once Tularia had finished speaking, Flashfire said,
Here is where my ship is.
Flashfire showed on his arm, said, Meet me there and you can come home with us.
Tularia then spoke up. Us. Flashfire went on to explain everything and that they had seen her upon their last visit and thought that she was a typical bloodthirsty, blood-craving typical Tailryan, and how you were here confounded us to how and why. They had steered completely clear of her as this was part of the path we were traveling to our destination on planet last time. Though this time after speaking with the peacekeepers found out that you were a different story. Flashfire then added, I'm very sorry for your mate and what has happened to you. With a soft gummy smile, Tularia reassured him that before the Vanduul did what they did, she and her mate were very much your stereotypical Tailryans. The Vanduul had implanted technology into their brains and it had taken with her, but her mate had feigned successful implantation and then tore a Vanduul scientist's throat out once it had got too close enough to him. Natural instincts took back over and he dispatched the Vanduul in moments. Although she was proud of her mate, she knew what was to come next, and it did. This is why she escaped, as at some stage they would have lost interest in her as well and done the same to her by killing her too.
The Vanduul testing facility is like a Noah's Ark of all fauna from the universe, a selection of every living animal and sentient being, and all were being tested and tortured to find the secret of immortality. The Vanduul weren't always like they are now. Through thousands of years had they evolved to this state. Chemicals, science, genetic restructuring, the implementation of the hive mind, the caste system and selective breeding, and now what we have today, monstrosities, no longer pure of genetic code but mutations from creatures the universe wide, all in the search of the better soldier and the immortal soul. Luckily for Tularia, the implant that the Vanduul had inserted into her brain had an unexpected malfunction due to brain chemistry, leading her to having empathy and human-like personality traits along with intuition, empathy, and very high brain function. She was almost human in every way of her personality now, and a far removed example of her species. Flashfire, coming to the realization, gave her some UECs, asked for her to feed herself and meet him back at his ship shortly. Tears began to roll down her face once again, and with a nod took the UECs and headed down the street with the directions to his ship tight in hand. Flashfire then sent through his report and findings to the administrator. The administrator at first was hesitant, but they were no longer black ops but subjugators, and in a moment of thought thanked Flashfire for his chivalry toward the creature, though once we get home it's, sorry, she is his responsibility. Any further actions that will need to be taken, including what we don't need to speak about, will be solely his responsibility. Flashfire agreed without hesitation, and the matter was settled. Soon they landed at the pad with the small gaunt-looking Tail Ryan waiting patiently by Flashfire's ship. They all introduced themselves, and they were no threat, and that they are here to help Flashfire get some work done. Tularia, with a gummy smile now with a full belly of food, said, "I'll happily wait for you to finish your business," and that she very much looked forward to seeing her new home. They all with wry smiles nodded and headed off into the dirty and dusty streets of Backwater City. Meanwhile, Flashfire was rounding the last bend to the Dark Horse Inn, the administrator updating on their location in the city and that they had met our new little friend. The new order was to meet at the brothel entrance, then move to surround and secure the local area in 30 minutes.
Make sure you are on time. We had intercepted a slaver transmission while coming in just now. Looks like our redhead is true to her name. She's been very problematic. And the brothel is looking at dealing with her. And they want a refund.
Slavers never give refunds ever. Flashfire agreed and told the administrator that he was just making a detour to see an old friend. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. The ghost administrator said that he should be careful, and that was it. Flashfire, thinking nothing of what was said, continued down the narrow street to the sign which was flickering on and off, noting the Dark Horse Inn in red and black on the wall above the doors to the bar. As he got closer, he heard a familiar voice, but not one he was happy to hear. He walked up to beside the entrance and hid around the corner, activated his high-density listening device on his arm set and began to record. It was Natalia. She was in the bar with Braca, no other voices but hers and his. The conversation was about fixing a little problem that had got out of hand. At first Flashfire was angered and confused to why he would even be speaking with a pirate, but as the conversation went on, the abhorred truth began to present itself. "My child, they have to be dealt with. The subjugators were a little pet project that's gone too far, and I have a need for them to, let's just say,
disappear."
From the history books. "You owe me a lot, my child, and now it's time you pay me back for all I have done for you," Braca said to Natalia. Natalia simply agreed, then tried to explain her situation and that this would have to wait until her little
excursion
was over first. Braca, sensing something was amiss, probed her to find out more information, though he had trained and coached far too well to fall for any of his psychology and tricks. She then said,
"Darling, don't you worry about my endeavors. I will get to yours in time and take great pleasure in doing it as well." Braca, begrudgingly knowing that he wasn't going to get anywhere with her, agreed to the belation of his request. As this was something that would need to be planned for by her and her crew and executed to the T anyway. The truth of all of this was going to be far stranger than fiction once everyone involved had come to its final shocking conclusion. Flashfire then saw her exiting the bar. He further retracted into the side alley and watched her walk off into the bustling streets and then out of sight. He ended the recording and, contemplating his next move, received a meeting agenda update on his arm set. He had 10 minutes to get to the brothel. Time he was off, he thought, this could be dealt with another day. Next time we could all go and confront Braca personally instead. As Flashfire worked his way through the streets, he came across a landing pad where Natalia's ship was just taking off from. Dust and detritus were being whirled up, engulfing him in the dust. Once the dust and detritus had begun to clear, he kept on his way with his arms set, guiding him to his destination. A few minutes later he found himself coming into sight of his fellow subjugators, who had also just arrived ready for briefing. The Ghost and the Wrangler, with 2 cases of 100-year-old Scotch receipts hanging out of their pockets, clearly stating on the docket Brax's Fine Liquor on the top of the receipts. They had already loaded it all on board their ships, ready for the trip home.
Well, all 4 cases were on the Wrangler's ship, but hey, that's how they roll yet. The briefing lead by the administrator, quickly outlining who was to flank where and who was responsible for extraction and execution step by step. All of the squad then moved into position, popping off one after the other. In position. The entire time the briefing was going on, Flashfire had a pained and mournful look on his face. He was dying to tell them what he had just experienced, but knew this took precedence and this was the main purpose for our mission now. He then also fell into position. Only a few moments later was the exercise on. Yelling and screaming of slaves being busted in on.
While at work.
To finally there was no more sound. Then the booming voice of the Ghost.
"Alright, you piece of fucking filth, where the fuck is she?"
In a thick and domineering Glaswegian voice. The madam then pointed and handed a key to the administrator. The Ghost snatched the key as it was being handed and stormed for the heavy titanium high-security door with nothing but a rudimentary strap and padlock on it. He opened the door to then see the beautiful freckle-faced red-headed woman in the dark corner of her cell. She had been severely beaten with cuts all over her body and had also soiled herself in the process. The anger that washed over the Wrangler and the Ghost was truly awe-inspiring as they both leapt back and with one shot the Wrangler shot the madam execution style in the head. The pimps and clients also were being shot one by one, room by room, execution style, until there was nothing but the poor slaves, both male and female, left in the premises. Local peacekeepers, knowing who they were, simply detoured to other parts of the city while this was going down, as they know what the motto of the subjugators is, and this was a slaver's brothel after all, and didn't want to have to worry about the paperwork, even if they could have got to that point after taking on the might of some extremely out of control subjugators. It was best to leave be, as true justice was being served anyway. Once the shooting and screaming had stopped, the subjugators, messed with blood spatter and brain matter strewn across their heavy armor, emerged out to the street. The administrator then called for the peacekeepers to do cleanup and to organize medical support for all of the newly released sex slaves. We were taking the redhead and the rest were their responsibility. The peacekeepers complied without question and thanked them for
cleaning up this part of town.
For them. The administrator then thanked them, and with the bruised and battered woman in their custody attended to her needs and placed her in a bed on one of the squad's cutlasses ships and gave her a sedative for the trip back to Jalan. As the last of the squad saddled up, the Ghost spoke up in a trembling and still furious voice.
"I'm sorry you all had to see that, but justice is sometimes a dish best served cold. Those poor people, those goddamn poor fucking people. I fucking hate this job sometimes."
The Wrangler then piped up and said,
"Ghost, we'll have a good drink once we're home, we'll have a drink for all of them."
The Ghost, through his tears and angered rage, calmed a little and thanked the Wrangler and told him he loved him, lol. Even through all of this he still had a sick and twisted humorous side, a coping mechanism for all the loss and sadness throughout his life. The Wrangler was his one constant and hopefully always will be. A brother in arms, a friend, and the closest thing he'd ever had to family his whole life. They then headed out from the planet and punched in the coordinates for Jalan. They were heading home, finally heading home. Our mission was complete. Well, all for Flashfire, who had a dark secret he was still to tell. Sanctuary. After a long and forever-ending journey, the subjugators made it to the Elysium sector on their final approach to Jalan. Several small skirmishes with outlaws in Auroras, but nothing to write home about, as they were dispatched in minutes each time. One with an escort of a wing of buccaneers, auroras and constellation Andromeda bristling with mantises and panthers even tried an interdiction which ended very quickly for them as well. The constellation didn't even have any ballistics or was in such an unkept state didn't fire a single shot other than from its under-bridge turret. It was a desperate and futile attempt after all was said and done. Soon all of the crew were beginning to chatter as the worst was behind them. They soon began to see Jalan on their radar and honed in for final approach. In the meantime, the other squads had already made it home and were making preparations for their new family. Medical services ward was already set up for our heroine and our new addition the tail Ryan Tularia, who was also in need of some health checks and vitamins to help her recover from her ordeal as well. All in all, a very successful mission. Once the subjugators had landed and the medical teams took over, the subjugators went for a well-deserved shower and clean up. Meanwhile, Gianna was playing with Ammon in the nearby forested hills, completely blissfully unaware that her mother had just made it back to her. This was by coincidence and was probably for the best, as her mother was a far cry of her former self and looked as bad as she felt. This poor woman had survived the unsurvivable and had made it. It was only fair that Gianna say her mother in a much better state than this. As the sun went down and Gianna and Ammon both entered back into the city with the doors closing soon behind them, did the apparent truth come to her acknowledgement. Her mother was here and she was alive. Gianna ran to the infirmary and begged to see her mother. The medical staff heavily advised that this wouldn't be a good idea right now, as they have had to perform multiple surgeries to save her life, including internal injuries to her reproductive system. Gianna fell to the floor in uncontrollable tears. Supernova, getting wind of what had just transpired, ran at full pace to Gianna's aid. Once Supernova had made it to the doors with Gianna on the ground uncontrollably sobbing, she picked her up and held her close, not saying a word, other than "She's here, she's safe and she's alive.
She will be okay, Gianna. She's just fine and safe with us now, and you and her will always be."
Gianna looked up for a moment and thanked her and went back to nestling into her breast and continued to hold on and cry. Supernova, with Gianna in her arms, asked for a medical update of actions to be sent to her arm set. The news was horrifying and deeply saddening. Her mother will never bear children again. Aside from that, she would recover and all other surgeries were 100% successful. They got to her in the nick of time. Hours passed by and Gianna had finally cried herself to sleep in Supernova's arms while sitting in the infirmary waiting room. Supernova herself had also fallen asleep sitting up. The doctors across the room through the windows all met and with what looked to be very positive wry smiles and handshakes finished their meeting. Soon after, the nurse entered into the waiting room and quietly stirred them both. "I've got some great news for you both." "Which one of you is Gianna?" With a wink to Supernova in the process, Gianna leapt to her feet and said,
"Me. Can I see my mum?"
The nurse smiled a truly genuine and loving happy smile, with tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, young lady, you can. You know how lucky you are, don't you? We got to her just in time. Seems you have some people to thank, don't you?" She then gave her a quick hug as the tears began to fall over her already heavily tear-stained cheeks again, while hugged by the nurse looked to Supernova with a stretched out hand without words, asking for her to accompany her to see her mother. Supernova without a word muttered, simply stood and went with her and the nurse and went to see her mother for the first time in so long. The nurse said quietly,
"She's sleeping. Your mother has been through a tremendous ordeal and she will need to stay with us for a week or two. You can visit her at any time, but for now maybe just give her a kiss on the forehead and hold her hand. She's been heavily sedated from the last surgery and it's for the nest, as the pain she'd be in wouldn't be worth it. She's already been through so much. We want to have her heal and wake with no pain once we think she's healed enough to ensure she's no longer in any pain. You understand, don't you, Gianna?"
Gianna agreed and gazed upon her mother. She still looked heavily bruised and beaten, but nowhere near what she looked like when she was brought in. Gianna quietly just sat and gazed at her mother all the time, not letting go of Supernova's hand with a firm but gentle grasp the entire time. Supernova gazing at both of them, for the first time in her life, seeing this and taking in the moment herself. In the meantime, Flashfire and the rest of the subjugators had showered, eaten and gone to bed. All for both Ghost and Wrangler, who had already knocked off half a case of scotch each. Both blinded, drunk and laughing and crying on each other's shoulders, with a small fire at their feet in one of the grassy entertainment areas. Inbuilt ground fire pit, near the doors. All that could be heard was belligerent mumbling from both the drinkers as the late hours set in. Flashfire, though, was sitting up in his bed listening to the recording again and again, trying to work out what else was being said other than the words themselves. As the hours went on, his eyelids became heavy and sleep took over. The drinkers, also beyond drunk, with bottles still in hand, fallen to their side on the soft grassy ground. And Gianna, asleep on Supernova, cuddled up on the chair in the corner of her mother's infirmary room. This had been a long and arduous journey, but this was just the beginning of what is to come next. Book 3 coming to a hellhole near you soon. Well, not that soon. We have to keep you guessing, don't we, Winky Face?